The council hall stretched across 1,000 pillars of crystal, each one glowing with the memory of fallen stars. The air shimmered with a weight that pressed down on every delegate who had gathered from every corner of the known galaxy. There were insect lords from the hive planets, feathered monarchs from the wind colonies, stone-skinned giants from the silent moons, and 100 more, all seated in vast circles of light that spiraled upward like a staircase to infinity. At the center stood the throne, a monument of power and vanity, carved from the remnants of a collapsed sun, its surface blazing faintly, as though it still remembered the moment it devoured itself. Upon that throne sat the Galactic King, his crown a circle of living fire that licked the air around his skull, his robe woven from comet tails shifting with every movement, his eyes two black holes that seemed to swallow light itself. He leaned back with the weight of eternity pressing against his shoulders, and still his arrogance filled the chamber like a flood. The delegates bowed their heads, not out of love, but out of fear, for none could forget the worlds that had burned when the king willed it so. The king rose slowly, his voice rolling through the hall like an avalanche of stone. He declared himself the master of stars, the keeper of order, the flame that held back the dark void. His words were heavy, and each syllable carried the memory of shattered empires. Yet behind the echo there was a tension, a whisper among the gathered that perhaps his power was not endless. Perhaps the age of the king was fraying at the edges. His silence after his speech felt longer than the orbit of planets. The delegates dared not speak, yet every thought collided in the air like sparks of lightning. The atmosphere was heavy with dread and anticipation, the weight of centuries pressing upon a single moment. When the doors of the human delegation opened, a wave of murmurs swept through the chamber. Many of the alien lords had never seen a human in the flesh. Their world had only recently risen into the stars. They were young, fragile, compared to the civilizations that had ruled for millions of years, yet they carried themselves with quiet defiance. Their leader stepped aside, and from behind them came not a warrior, not a sage, but a child. The child was small and unassuming, no armor, no crown, no glittering jewels to announce their worth. They carried only a small wooden toy carved with simple lines. The gift was plain, yet pure, meant to speak across the gulf of cultures and power. It was an offering of peace, unshaped by arrogance. The Galactic King watched the child approach, his lips curled into a smile that was not kind, but sharp with disdain. The murmurs of the council rose higher, some confused, some horrified, others merely curious. But beneath the noise one truth became clear. The king did not see a gesture of peace. He saw insult, he saw mockery, he saw weakness. The child stopped at the foot of the throne and raised the toy with trembling hands. The hall fell into perfect silence, a silence so deep it felt like the vacuum between galaxies. Every gaze fixed upon the king, waiting for the judgment that would decide whether peace might take root or whether war would spread like wildfire once again. And in that silence the king's hand twitched as though a storm gathered inside his veins, and the delegates felt the first crack of lightning in the air, though none could know how swiftly it would strike. The child stood at the base of the throne, their small hands still clutching the wooden toy, the grain of the wood polished by hours of holding and shaping it with care. The gift seemed fragile in the light of the council hall, so fragile that even the shimmering air around the king threatened to scorch it. The delegates leaned forward, unable to believe that such a simple object was being offered to the most powerful being in the galaxy. The king gazed down at the child, his expression unreadable, his crown of fire twisting with faint cracks of heat around his head. The flames hissed and bent as though eager to leap upon the offering. The silence deepened as every creature present realized they were standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. The human delegation stood behind the child with faces hard as stone, yet their eyes burned with purpose. They had chosen this path carefully. They had not brought armies or weapons. They had not brought gold or rare minerals. They had brought only truth. They had brought only the image of innocence to remind the galaxy of what was worth saving. The council had seen treaties before. They had seen lies and riches exchanged like water, but they had never seen a gesture so bare, so pure. The child took one trembling step closer. The marble beneath their feet echoed louder than thunder in that great hall, each step a drumbeat, calling down fate. They raised the toy higher so that the light from the pillars caught it and made it gleam. Though it was nothing but simple wood carved by a human hand, the light made it seem almost divine. Murmur ran through the delegates, some scoffed, whispering that humans were foolish to insult the king with such a trinket. Others felt their throats tighten as though something sacred had entered the room. Even the most hardened warlords felt a strange stirring, a memory of when their species too had been young, when their hearts had known gentleness before power had hardened them. King shifted forward upon his throne, his eyes narrowing. The black holes of his gaze seemed to pierce the child, as though he would unravel their existence with sight alone. His lips moved and his voice came low, not the roaring avalanche from earlier, but a whisper sharp enough to cut stone. He asked if this was truly the offering of humankind, if this toy, this worthless fragment of wood, was all they thought the stars deserved. The child did not speak. Their lips pressed together, their small fingers clutched tighter around the toy. Their silence was louder than any cry, and for the briefest instant a shimmer of doubt flickered in the eyes of those gathered. The king rose to his full height, the throne blazing behind him like a dying sun, his hand lifted heavy with jewels, his rings catching firelight as if the cosmos itself had been trapped inside his palm. He stood above the child like a mountain of pride and rage, and in that moment the air itself seemed to wait. The delegates held their breath. No voice dared interrupt the scene. Every creature, every ruler, every warrior present knew that history itself was pausing, balanced upon the edge of a single action. And the child looked up, eyes wide, not with fear, but with a strange quiet courage, as if they already knew what the universe would demand next. The Galactic King towered above the child, his jeweled hand rising slowly through the air, each movement heavy with arrogance and the weight of absolute power. The flames of his crown licked higher, as if they rejoiced in the violence about to be unleashed. The council chamber trembled with anticipation, though no one dared move, no one dared to breathe. Every gaze was locked upon the fragile human figure standing at the foot of the throne. The silence was suffocating. It pressed against the walls like an invisible ocean, yet within that silence every delegate felt the same shiver of disbelief. The child had offered a gift of peace, and the king, the ruler of countless worlds, was about to answer it, not with words, not with measured judgment, but with raw cruelty. The child did not step back, their small frame frozen, their eyes raised to the towering figure above them. There was no defiance in their stance, yet neither was there surrender. It was something beyond fear, something beyond hope, a quiet acceptance of the moment that carried a strange strength into the room. The jeweled hand of the king descended faster than thought, a streak of fire and gold through the heavy air. The crack of impact exploded like thunder rolling across a mountain range. It echoed up through the crystal pillars, down the marble steps, through the bones of every creature gathered in the chamber. The child collapsed, their toy falling from their hands and clattering against the shining floor. The wood rolled slowly across the marble, the sound sharp and piercing as though the universe itself marked the betrayal with a cry of grief. The figure of innocence lay still upon the cold stone. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. The council delegates froze, their faces pale, their bodies locked between outrage and terror. The insect lords clicked their mandibles in shock. The feathered monarchs shivered, their wings tight against their backs. The stone-skinned giants lowered their heads, not in obedience, but in sorrow. No one spoke, no one dared on. Yet among the human delegation, not a single voice rose in anger, not a single hand reached for vengeance. They stood like statues, their eyes fixed upon the fallen child. Their silence was not weakness, it was a storm contained behind unbroken walls, a silence that shook the hearts of all who witnessed it. The Galactic King lowered his hands slowly, his jeweled fingers glimmering with the light of his cruel strike. His laughter rumbled deep, a sound that scraped against the walls like blades. He declared that this was the fate of the weak, that peace was the delusion of children, and that power alone would shape the destiny of the stars. But beneath his laughter, an unease began to spread unseen. The air trembled, not with fear but with a weight that came from beyond him, a weight that pressed down, heavier with every breath. The delegates shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the fallen child and the human delegation, as if something ancient and unstoppable had just awakened. The wooden toy rolled to a stop at the base of the throne, a single fragment of innocence, untouched by the blow, and in its stillness, the hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer that was already forming in the shadows. The child lay motionless upon the marble floor, their small chest rising only faintly, as though even the act of breathing had become too heavy for such a fragile body. The wooden toy sat just beyond reach, gleaming softly in the glow of the crystal pillars. The council chamber was vast, yet in that moment it felt unbearably small, as if all of creation had been forced into a single fragile heartbeat. The delegates stared, unable to move, their wings folded tight, their claws gripped their armrests, their stone fingers clenched until cracks spread across them, yet still no sound came forth. The insect lords who had once screamed battle Cries loud enough to split skies now clicked only in muted terror. The feathered monarchs who had sung songs of victory now drooped their feathers as though winter had fallen upon them. The giants who had shaken worlds with a single step now bowed their heavy heads, unable to meet the sight before them. The silence spread through the hall, not the silence of peace nor the silence of death, but something heavier, something sharper. It was the silence of judgment, waiting unseen, the silence of a storm gathering its breath behind mountains before it roared across plains. The humans stood behind the fallen child, their faces still as carved stone, their lips sealed, their eyes unmoving. No shouts of anger, no cries of grief passed from them, and this quiet unsettled the council more deeply than any scream could have done. Some whispered to themselves that the humans were broken by fear. Others whispered that perhaps they were not broken at all. Perhaps their silence was more dangerous than rage. The Galactic King gazed upon the hall, his chest swelled with cruel pride. He mistook the silence for surrender. He mistook the stillness for weakness. He declared that all who sought peace through frailty would find only humiliation. He spread his arms wide, his crown of fire casting wild shadows across the chamber, as he boasted that power alone was the law of stars and that his hand was the hand of destiny. But the delegates shifted uneasily, their gazes drawn again and again, not to the king but to the small body on the marble floor, and to the human delegation, whose stillness carried a weight they could not measure. It was as if a great shadow loomed behind them, though no eyes could see it directly. The wooden toy glimmered where it rested. The faint light dancing along its surface made the air ripple subtly, though none spoke of it and none dared move closer. The council could feel it, even if they could not understand it. The toy was no mere trinket. It had become a symbol in that instant, and symbols have power beyond crowns and empires. The silence pressed harder. The marble floor seemed to have grown. The very pillars seemed to hum, as though the crystal remembered ancient songs of justice, long buried yet not forgotten. The air grew colder, every breath visible like mist, as if the void itself had entered the hall. And still the humans said nothing, their silence stretching longer, heavier, until it felt as though the universe itself had leaned in to listen. The silence inside the council hall deepened until it felt alive, pressing against every chest and whispering into every mind. The delegates shifted uneasily, their gazes darting between the fallen child, the silent human delegation, and the Galactic King who still stood tall upon his blazing throne. And then from within the shadows cast by the pillars, a figure began to rise. The figure was cloaked in shifting light. Sometimes it seemed made of fire, sometimes of shadow, sometimes of starlight, that flickered like galaxies, unfolding and collapsing all at once. No one could say when it had entered the chamber. No one had seen the doors open. No one had felt footsteps cross the floor. And yet there it stood, a presence undeniable. The figure was tall, yet not impossibly so, its movements slow and deliberate, its face hidden beneath the hood of its shifting cloak. The very air bent around it, as if the laws of gravity were drawn to its will. Each step forward echoed, not with sound but with weight, the kind of weight that pressed deep into the bones of every creature present, the kind of weight that made hearts falter. The insect lords leaned back, their wings rattling, as though struck by an unseen wind. The feathered monarchs lowered, their eyes feathers trembling with unspoken fear. The stone-skinned giants pressed their fists against the marble to steady themselves, for they felt as if the floor itself might collapse beneath them at any moment. The Galactic King narrowed his black hole eyes, his crown of fire flickering with unease. Though his lips still curled into a sneer, he demanded the figure speak. He demanded to know what power dared rise unbidden in his hall. But the figure gave no answer. It simply stood still, its silence colder, sharper than the silence of the humans. Its silence was a blade waiting to be drawn. The delegates felt the air grow heavier, their lungs straining, as though the void itself had settled inside the hall. Shadows deepened across the marble. The flames of the throne guttered and dimmed as though cowering before the unseen force. The child upon the floor stirred faintly, as if even unconscious they could feel the shift in the balance of power. The king raised his jeweled scepter, pointing it toward the cloaked figure. His voice thundered that no shadow could challenge the master of stars, that no nameless ghost could face the fire of the crown. His laughter followed, shaking the walls like avalanches, but behind that laughter lingered the first crack of doubt. The cloaked figure did not move, it did not flinch, it did not even breathe, at least not in a way any mortal could see. Instead it seemed to grow larger, though its size did not change. The chamber itself seemed to shrink around it, as if space itself bent to its presence. The council hall now felt like a cage, and the king, the one trapped inside the humans, remained silent, their eyes fixed upon the guardian they had brought forth. Though none spoke, none bowed, none gestured, The truth became clear to all who watched. This was no envoy, no negotiator. This was a judgment, though no word had yet been spoken. The council felt the judgment already forming in the air, heavy as a storm that could no longer be held back. The cloaked figure stood unmoving in the center of the hall, its presence pressing against the marble and the crystal pillars as though the very structure of the chamber was bending under its weight. The delegates trembled, some trying to avert their gaze but finding their eyes drawn back again and again, unable to resist the force that radiated from the silent guardian. The humans did not move there. Faces still carved from stone, their silence joined with the silence of the figure, until the two seemed one and the same. The Galactic King straightened his shoulders, his crown of fire snapping upward as if in defiance, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He spread his arms wide, his jeweled scepter glimmering with imprisoning light, and his voice rolled across the chamber like waves breaking upon cliffs. He demanded to know who this shadow was, who had dared enter unbidden, who had dared to challenge the keeper of order and flame. He mocked the silence, he called it cowardice, he called it emptiness, he called it nothing. At all the cloaked figure did not reply. It did not bow, it did not even tilt its head. Its silence grew heavier, colder, sharper. With every passing moment, the air thickened until it felt like molten iron. In the lungs of every delegate, the insect lords hissed their antennae, curling tightly against their skulls. The feathered monarchs shivered, feathers falling loose and drifting across the marble like snow. The stone giants ground their teeth, the sound echoing like boulders rolling down a mountain. The king laughed, the sound cutting across the silence like a blade forged of arrogance. He claimed no silence could ever undo him, no void could ever consume his flame. He raised his scepter high above his head, declaring that he would strike down both the child and the shadow, and every witness would remember forever that power belonged only to him still. The figure did not move, its stillness became unbearable. The council members felt sweat gather on their skin, though some had never known sweat before. Their hearts pounded, though some had never known fear before. The flames of the crown wavered, bending as though pulled toward the silent guardian. The marble floor beneath its feet darkened, faintly as though burned not by fire but by absence itself. The king snarled, his laughter turning harsh, his eyes blazing blacker than the void. He proclaimed that the galaxy had no place for illusions, no patience for quiet shadows. He shouted that he was eternal, that his hand was the hand of destiny itself, that no being, living or dead, could defy him. The cloaked figure at last raised its head only slightly, and in that subtle motion the chamber seemed to fracture, though no sound accompanied it. The delegates felt the weight of eternity shift like a planet sliding in its orbit. The king faltered just for a breath, yet still he tried to raise his scepter higher, forcing his pride to carry him through the dread that gnawed at the edges of his soul. And in that fragile pause, when silence towered taller than any throne, the council realized that the laughter of the king was hollow, that the crown of fire no longer ruled the room, and that the true center of power now stood cloaked in stillness, waiting for judgment to fall. The Galactic King tightened his grip on the jeweled scepter, his knuckles glowing as though molten fire pulsed beneath his skin. The council chamber quivered with the weight of his fury. His laughter turned to a roar that shook the crystal pillars like a storm shaking trees. He shouted that shadows had no power, that silence was weakness, that no guardian, no phantom, no nameless wanderer could rise against the hand that shaped the stars. He lifted the scepter higher, his crown of fire blazing brighter, as if it would consume the very air around him. Sparks rained down across the marble floor, each one burning away before it touched the surface. His cloak of comet light swirled violently around his body, giving him the image of a god at war with creation itself. The delegates recoiled, some covering their faces, others gripping the edges of their thrones, unable to tear their gaze away. Even as dread seeped into their bones, the cloaked guardian remained unmoving, its presence unshaken by the fury that poured from the king. It stood like the center of a storm, untouched by the chaos spinning around it. Silence wrapped around its form, heavier with every passing heartbeat. The air thickened until even breathing felt like swallowing stone. The delegates felt their chests ache as if their hearts would burst. Beneath the invisible weight, the child lay still upon the marble, the wooden toy resting in the shadow of the throne. The flickering light from the crown of fire danced across it, making it gleam faintly, though it remained untouched by flame. Some of the delegates noticed this, and their unease grew, for the toy seemed to glow stronger the longer the silence lingered. The king raised his voice one final time, vowing to strike down the shadow, vowing to strike down the humans, vowing to erase every whisper of resistance from the stars. He brought the scepter down in a sweeping arc, a blow meant to crush bone and silence forever. But before the weapon could fall, the cloaked figure moved. Its motion was not swift in the way of blades or arrows. It was something else entirely. It was the absence of motion, the collapse of distance, the folding of space itself. One instant the scepter roared downward. The next instant it was no longer in the hand of the king. His arm hung empty, the jewel-tipped weapon spinning through the air before it shattered into fragments of light against the marble. The king staggered, his crown flickering as though shaken by the force that had passed through him. His eyes widened, the black holes trembling at their edges, as though they feared being swallowed by something greater than themselves. He opened his mouth to roar again, but the sound caught in his throat, choked back by the rising tide of silence. The cloaked figure stood directly before him, now closer than any had seen, its presence filling the space like a tidal wave. The king raised his jeweled hand, desperate to strike with raw strength alone, but in the moment he moved, the guardian lifted one shadowed arm, and the entire chamber felt the universe hold its breath. And, though no blow had yet fallen, the council already knew the king would not survive the silence that had become his final judge. The council chamber froze as the cloaked guardian raised its shadowed arm. The air thickened until it seemed the pillars themselves would shatter under the weight. The flames of the king's crown sputtered and bent as though some greater force had smothered their pride. The Galactic King's chest heaved, his mouth opened in a defiant roar, yet no sound came forth, for silence had grown too heavy to absolute. The delegates leaned forward, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling, for they understood that they were no longer witnesses to a dispute. They were witnesses to judgment, written not in words, but in inevitability. The insect lords twitched, their antennae pressed flat against their skulls. The feathered monarchs held their wings tight, as though shielding themselves from a storm. The stone-skinned giants pressed their fists to the marble as if anchoring themselves against the pull of something greater than gravity. The king thrust his jeweled hand forward, desperate to strike with sheer force. His rings glimmered like captured stars, his eyes burned blacker than the void. His roar finally escaped, ripping through the chamber like a collapsing world. But before his hand could connect, before his strength could even meet resistance, the guardian's shadow swept through the space between them. No flash, no fire, no thunder accompanied the motion, only silence heavier than death itself. Yet in that silence, the crown of fire shattered into sparks. The jewels upon the king's hand cracked and fell away, and his body lurched as if the weight of eternity itself had torn through him. His head severed from his body in an instant, so swift that even the stars carved into the pillars seemed to blink in disbelief. The jeweled head rolled from his shoulders, the crown breaking into shards that scattered like meteors across the marble floor. His body collapsed, lifeless, upon the steps of the throne. The roar that had begun in his throat ended as nothing but a hollow gasp that faded into the silence. The delegates cried out at last, the insect lords shrieking in unison, the feathered monarchs unleashing cries that echoed like mourning songs, the stone giants bellowing deep as avalanches crashing down mountains. Yet none dared rise from their seats, for the cloaked guardian still stood, its shadow heavier than ever. The jeweled head rolled to a stop upon the marble, resting in the light of the crystal pillars, its black whole eyes now empty, its mouth still curved into the echo of arrogance, but no voice remained within. The silence around it became complete, absolute, final. The guardian lowered its arm, and turned not toward the body of the king, not toward the crown now broken, but toward the fallen child who still breathed faintly upon the floor, the wooden toy resting by their side, untouched by destruction. The guardian bent low, shadows folding like wings around its frame, and with a motion as gentle as a whisper, it lifted the child into its arms. The council hall trembled once more, not with fury, not with fear, but with the realization that innocence had been protected, that the arrogance of power had been undone, not by armies, not by gold, not by treaties, but by silence, and by judgment. And as the guardian stood tall again, the jeweled head of the Galactic King lay forgotten at the foot of the throne, a relic of pride stripped of meaning forever. The jeweled head of the Galactic King lay upon the marble, its crown shattered, its black hole eyes staring blankly into nothingness. The body slumped heavy and lifeless against the steps of the throne, the once unshakable ruler of countless worlds, now reduced to silence, his arrogance extinguished in the same stillness. He had mocked the council chamber, breathed again, though none dared to speak, for all knew they had witnessed more than the fall of a king. They had witnessed the turning of an edge. The cloaked guardian stood tall, the child resting gently in its arms, the wooden toy clutched tightly against the small chest. The glow of the crystal pillars bathed them in light, as though the hall itself acknowledged where true power now resided. The humans remained silent, their delegation unbroken, their eyes fixed upon the guardian, as though they had always known this moment would Come, and the council felt the weight of their silence, heavier now than ever. The insect lords bowed, their antennae brushing against the floor in submission. The feathered monarchs spread their wings wide in reverence, their feathers trembling. Like leaves in the wind, the stone-skinned giants lowered their heads, pounding their fists once against the marble in a gesture of respect. None dared challenge what had been decided, none dared question what had been revealed. The law of crowns had ended, and a deeper law had taken its place. The guardian moved forward, each step measured, each echo ringing. Like the toll of ancient bells, it carried the child with care, ascending the steps of the throne, where the broken body of the king still lay. The head upon the marble glimmered faintly as if refusing to be forgotten, but the guardian lifted it with one hand, shadows curling around it, and turned to face the council. No words were spoken, yet all understood the message as the guardian raised the severed head high for every delegate to see. The silence stretched into eternity, a silence filled not with fear but with warning, carved into the very bones of the universe, a warning that no ruler, no empire, no throne could strike at. Innocence without consequence. The guardian placed the head upon a pillar beside the throne, the crystal surface glowing faintly beneath it as though sealing the act into memory for all ages to come. The jeweled crown lay shattered across the floor, its fragments scattered like the remnants of a fallen star, the symbol of pride now nothing but dust and shards. Pillar stood taller than all others, its burden clear to every eye. The child stirred faintly within the guardian's cloak, a soft breath rising against the silence. The wooden toy still clutched firmly. The council bowed, not to the guardian, not to the humans, but to the law that had revealed itself. The law, older than empires, older than kings. The law that innocence was sacred, and that the universe itself would rise to protect it. The cloaked guardian turned then without ceremony, carrying the child back toward the human delegation. The hall remained bowed, the delegates frozen in reverence as shadows folded around the figure once more. The silence lingered, not as dread but as memory, etched into the crystal pillars, into the marble floor, into the hearts of all who had witnessed it. And so the jeweled head hung high in the council hall, a grim warning, a solemn vow, a beacon that no hand may ever again strike the innocent without the universe itself demanding judgment in return.